January 1945. The Netherlands lies locked beneath winter. Canals are frozen solid, fields are empty. Church bells no longer ring for weddings, only for funerals. In narrow brick houses, children sit wrapped in coats meant for outdoors. Their cheeks are hollow. Their hands are still. Pots rest on stoves without fuel beneath them. Bread has become a memory measured in weeks, not days. Sugar, fat, milk, gone. Tulip bulbs are boiled and eaten, their bitterness swallowed in silence. Outside, wooden shoes scrape across snow, covered streets as civilians move slowly, conserving strength. Every step costs calories they do not have. Trams stand abandoned. Horses have vanished. Even trees have been stripped for firewood. Far beyond the frozen rivers and shattered rail lines, artillery rumbles faintly. The war is close, but relief is not. Then, one morning, unfamiliar sounds break the stillness. Engines, voices speaking English. Vehicles rolling where none have passed for months. For the first time in a starving winter, the cold air carries something else. Hope, fragile, sudden, and overwhelming. The moment did not begin with victory speeches or flags, but with hunger finally meeting food. And that moment had been years in the making. How the Netherlands was pushed toward starvation by the winter of 1944. The Netherlands had already endured more than 4 years under German occupation. The invasion had come swiftly in May 1940. Within days, Rotterdam burned. After the Luftwaffe bombing, the Dutch government capitulated, and the country was folded into Hitler's expanding Reich. What followed was not constant front-line fighting, but something slower and more corrosive. Control. German authorities dismantled Dutch sovereignty piece by piece. Railways were seized. Industry was redirected toward the German war machine. Food production, once efficient and export-oriented, was brought under strict rationing. At first, civilians survived. Bread was limited but available. Potatoes remained on tables. Children were thin but alive. Resistance grew quietly. Illegal newspapers circulated. Railway workers sabotaged lines. Dutch families hid Jews, airmen, and draft evaders. Each act was answered with arrests, deportations, and executions. By 1942 and 1943, tens of thousands of Dutch Jews had already been transported east. Few would return. In June 1944, the sound of liberation reached the Netherlands from across the Channel. Allied forces landed in Normandy, opening the Western Front at last. As American, British, and Canadian armies pushed inland, the Netherlands became a prize, not just for morale, but for strategy. Its rivers controlled access to Germany's industrial heartland. Its ports could feed entire armies. Its bridges could decide the speed of the Allied advance. By September, hope surged. Operation Market Garden was launched. The bold airborne assault intended to seize key bridges and open a rapid path into Germany. American paratroopers dropped near Eindhoven and Nijmegen. British airborne forces pushed toward Arnhem. For a moment, liberation felt imminent, but the operation stalled. At Arnhem, the bridge was held too far too long. German resistance stiffened. Supply lines stretched thin. By late September 1944, Market Garden had failed. The southern Netherlands was partially freed. The north and west, including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, remained occupied. The front line froze just as winter approached. That pause, more than any single battle, sealed the fate of millions of civilians still trapped behind German lines. And the consequences of that failure were about to extend far beyond the battlefield. The hunger winter begins. The German response to the stalled Allied advance was deliberate and devastating. In September 1944, as Dutch railway workers went on strike in support of the Allied push, German authorities retaliated with a transport embargo. Barges were halted. Rail shipments were suspended. Food from the rural eastern provinces could no longer reach the densely populated western cities. What had been scarcity became starvation. The winter of 1944-45 arrived early and with unusual severity. Temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. Canals iced over, cutting off the last remaining means of transport. Coal shipments ceased. Electricity faltered. Without fuel, kitchens went cold. Without transport, food disappeared. Daily rations collapsed to a fraction of survival needs. By November, adults were receiving less than 1,000 calories a day. By February, official rations in some areas fell below 500. Children weakened first. Elderly residents followed. People stripped cities of anything burnable. Park benches vanished. Doors were dismantled. Entire rows of trees were cut down in the night. Furniture was fed into stoves that barely warmed rooms. Food substitutes became normal. Sugar beets were chewed raw. Tulip bulbs were traded and boiled despite their toxicity. Bread, when found, was stretched with sawdust or potato peels. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from edema, night blindness, and extreme weight loss. Doctors documented children who could no longer cry. Schools closed, not because of bombing, but because students were too weak to walk. An estimated 20,000 people died during the hunger winter. Many more suffered permanent physical and psychological damage. The majority of victims were civilians. Thousands were children. German forces did not withdraw. They remained in control of the Western Netherlands, guarding food depots, while the population starved around them. The war for these civilians was no longer about ideology or territory. It was about surviving one more day. And then, in early 1945, the front began to move again. The Allied armies were closing in from the south and east. Rivers that had once blocked them were crossed. German units, exhausted and overstretched, started to crumble. For the people of the Netherlands, liberation was no longer a rumor carried by illegal radios. It was approaching, with soldiers who would see, firsthand, what hunger had done. Human hunger, soldier shock, the human angle. By the time American soldiers approached the Western Netherlands in early 1945, the civilian population was already living at the edge of physical collapse. Families had reorganized life around hunger. Meals were no longer eaten together. Food was divided carefully, often favoring children who still had a chance to recover. Mothers walked for hours into the countryside, trading linens, jewelry, even wedding rings for a sack of potatoes or a few carrots. Many returned empty-handed, burning more calories than they could replace. Children stopped growing. Doctors recorded weights normally seen in toddlers on bodies twice their age. Classrooms, where they remained open, were silent. Not from discipline, but from exhaustion. Hunger dulled speech, emotion, and movement. Death became quiet. There were no explosions, no rubble. People simply did not wake up. Yet even in starvation, social order held. Neighbors shared scraps. Churches organized soup kitchens that served water, thin broth. The Dutch population did not riot. It endured, waiting for something to change. The soldier angle for American troops pushing northward. This was not a battlefield they recognized. They were trained to expect resistance, ambush, and counterattack. Instead, they entered towns where civilians barely had the strength to stand. Soldiers wrote later of streets lined not with cheering crowds, but with people watching silently, eyes fixed on rations and mess tins. Many soldiers broke protocol immediately. Official supply chains were not designed for mass civilian feeding, yet food was handed out anyway. See rations, chocolate, canned meat, bread. Officers struggled to balance discipline with instinct. Feeding too much, too fast could kill the starved. Feeding too little felt unbearable. For some Americans, it was the first time the war felt personal. Not strategic, not ideological, immediate. The enemy was no longer just German units retreating ahead of them. It was hunger itself, and it was everywhere. That realization would shape how commanders, medics, and soldiers responded next. Leadership, morality, and a collapsing enemy. The leadership angle, Allied commanders understood that the liberation of territory did not automatically mean the survival of its people. As American and Canadian units advanced into the Netherlands in early 1945, reports from civil affairs officers became increasingly urgent. Entire districts were malnourished. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Local authorities, weakened by years of occupation, lacked the means to respond. Military leadership now faced a dilemma. Combat operations demanded speed and supply discipline. Yet delaying humanitarian action meant more civilian deaths by the day. Commanders authorized emergency food distributions even before formal relief systems were in place. Field kitchens were redirected. Medical units were reassigned. Civil affairs detachments worked alongside Dutch officials to assess needs street by street. This was not charity detached from war. It was a strategic necessity. Starving populations could not stabilize liberated zones, nor could armies ignore suffering unfolding directly in their path. The line between combat leadership and humanitarian responsibility had vanished. The moral angle for individual soldiers, the question was simpler and heavier. Many had seen destruction in France, Belgium, and Germany, bombed cities, displaced civilians. But starvation on this scale, deliberate and prolonged, was something different. Hunger stripped people of dignity quietly. There were no ruins to point at, only bodies. Soldiers were warned not to overfeed children. Medics explained refeeding syndrome, though the term was rarely used yet. Even so, the instinct to help was overwhelming. Chocolate bars were broken into pieces. Bread was torn carefully, measured by hand. Tears were common, not from civilians alone. Hardened infantrymen turned away so children would not see them cry. The war, which had been defined by orders and objectives, suddenly carried moral weight that no manual could address. The enemy-angled German forces in the Netherlands were retreating, but not defeated in spirit or structure. Many units still guarded warehouses and transport hubs. Orders to maintain control were obeyed long after strategic value had faded. The suffering of civilians was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate policy, enforced even as Germany itself collapsed. Yet discipline within German ranks was eroding. Desertions increased. Supplies dwindled. Command authority fractured. By the time Allied troops reached the western cities, resistance was uneven and often symbolic. The enemy still held ground, but it no longer held the future. And with each mile advanced, American soldiers moved closer to the moment when liberation would stop being an idea and become something you could taste. When liberation became immediate, April 1945, the winter that had nearly killed the Netherlands was loosening its grip. But hunger had not released its hold. In the western cities, bodies were still failing faster than spring could arrive. American and Canadian units moved steadily through liberated corridors, crossing rivers that had once seemed impassable. German resistance thinned with each advance. White flags appeared in windows. Checkpoints were abandoned without a shot. Then Allied vehicles rolled into towns that had not seen fresh supplies in months. The contrast was immediate and brutal. Soldiers stepped from trucks carrying full packs into streets lined with civilians who weighed half as much as they should have. Children gathered without shouting. They did not run. Many simply stood and watched, as if afraid movement might cost them the strength they had left. Food appeared first in small gestures. A can opened, a ration shared. Medics knelt to examine swollen legs and hollow eyes. Officers ordered field kitchens set up before headquarters tents. Word spread faster than orders. Starving families emerged from cellars and back rooms. Parents held children forward, not in desperation, but in trust. Some civilians collapsed after eating too quickly. Medics intervened, adjusting portions, explaining patiently, working through the night. Feeding became as careful as surgery. This was not celebration. It was triage. American soldiers did not record the moment as a victory. They remembered it as silence breaking, the quiet realization that the war had reached its most human point. And as Allied control expanded, this improvised mercy began to turn into something larger, more organized, and more urgent, feeding a nation. As the front line moved forward in April and early May 1945, relief efforts accelerated alongside combat operations. American units coordinated with Canadian forces, Dutch officials, and medical personnel to stabilize entire districts at once. What had begun as spontaneous sharing became structured distribution. Food was measured. Schedules were established. Children were prioritized. The most severely malnourished were identified and treated first. Field kitchens multiplied. Large cauldrons of soup appeared in town squares that had been empty for months. Bread was sliced under supervision. Milk, scarce and precious, was rationed carefully. Soldiers stood guard not against crowds but against chaos, ensuring order so everyone could eat. For many children, the first American-issued meal was not remembered for taste, but for what followed. Warmth returned, speech returned, eyes focused again. Some cried for the first time in weeks, startling parents who had grown used to frightening quiet. American medics documented cases of extreme starvation rarely seen in the Western European theater. Weight loss of over 40% was common among children. Adults showed muscle wasting, heart weakness, and infections their bodies could no longer fight. And yet amid exhaustion, emotion broke through. Civilians wept openly. Not in hysteria, in release. Men removed caps and stood silently as food was served. Women pressed hands together in gestures that required no translation. American soldiers, many barely in their 20s, found themselves surrounded by gratitude they did not know how to accept. They had not ended the war alone. They had not planned this moment. But they were present when hunger ended. By early May, German forces in the Netherlands surrendered. The fighting stopped. But for the Dutch people, the turning point had already occurred. Not at a signing table, but at the moment their children ate without fear. That moment carried forward, shaping everything that followed. Counting the cost. When the fighting ended in the Netherlands in May 1945, the silence that followed revealed the scale of what hunger had done. Official Dutch records, compiled in the months after liberation, confirmed what doctors and aid workers already knew. Approximately 20,000 civilians had died during the hunger winter. Many more survived with damage that could not be undone, hearts weakened by prolonged malnutrition, bones thinned, immune systems broken. Hospitals did not empty when the war ended, they filled. Children arrived with swollen limbs, stunted growth, and infections that ordinary bodies would have resisted. Some recovered quickly once fed, others did not. Doctors observed developmental delays that would follow survivors for decades. Hunger had reached into the future. American military reports noted the unusual nature of the crisis. Unlike bombed cities, Infrastructure in much of the Western Netherlands remained standing. Roads, homes, schools, all intact. What had collapsed was the invisible system that kept people alive. For soldiers, the memory lingered long after redeployment. Letters home described the shock of seeing famine in a modern European nation. Veterans later spoke less about enemy fire and more about the children who watched them eat. Dutch civilians, too weak to celebrate immediately, began slowly to rebuild routines. Schools reopened, markets resumed, bread became normal again. But normal did not erase memory. The war had ended, but the reckoning had only begun. And as recovery moved forward, the meaning of what American soldiers had done, and what they had witnessed, settled into something deeper than relief. Memory, gratitude, and a lasting bond. In the years that followed liberation, the Netherlands did not forget the spring of 1945. For those who had survived the hunger winter as children, the arrival of American soldiers became a defining life memory. Not as conquerors, not as symbols of power, but as the moment when starvation ended, when the body stopped shrinking, when the future reopened. Dutch municipalities documented relief efforts carefully. Food distribution records, medical reports, and civil affairs correspondence were preserved, not for propaganda, but for understanding. The famine was studied, its causes were traced, its consequences measured across generations. A lasting bond formed quietly. Dutch families maintained contact with American veterans. Letters were exchanged. Visits followed. Graves of American soldiers were tended with care, especially at sites like the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten. Names were adopted by local families, responsibility passed from one generation to the next. Public remembrance took shape without spectacle. Anniversaries marked the end of occupation. School children learned not only dates and battles, but the cost of hunger and the meaning of aid. For American veterans, the Netherlands remained different from other battlefields. It was remembered not only for fighting, but for feeding, not only for liberation, but for lives saved after the shooting stopped. The war's legacy in the Netherlands was not defined solely by victory or defeat. It was defined by survival, and by the hands that made survival possible. That understanding carries forward, shaping how this moment is remembered today. War is often remembered through maps and arrows, lines advancing, cities taken, dates underlined in textbooks. But in the Netherlands, the meaning of the war narrowed to something smaller and more lasting. It became about children who lived long enough to grow, about bodies that recovered instead of disappearing quietly in winter rooms, about a nation that learned how close civilization can come to collapse without a single building falling. The American soldiers who entered the Netherlands in 1945 did not arrive with a plan to become saviors. They came to finish a war. Yet history placed them in the moment when food mattered more than firepower. What they offered was not just calories. It was time. Time for hearts to strengthen, for children to heal, for a society to begin again. The tears that followed were not symbols. They were evidence. Evidence that war's true measure is not only how it is fought, but what is done when the fighting ends. That victory, at its most human, is not heard in gunfire or declared in documents. It is felt when hunger stops, and in that quiet turning point, when starving children ate and lived, a nation remembered who had been there and why it mattered.